Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth part about Western Rome surviving in Britain. I hope you continue to enjoy this series, and without further ado, let's pick up where we left off. The Romano-British Empire, or as it would now proudly call itself, the restored Western Roman Empire, would have just emerged victorious from the greatest conflict Europe would have seen in centuries, a conflict that, as I said in the previous parts, could be considered the equivalent of the 100 Years' War of this alternate timeline. It would have been a war fought with ideas, identities, and the very question of who, in the West, had the right to call themselves the legitimate successors of Rome. And after that war, after a century of devastating campaigns, sieges, naval blockades, and ideological warfare, the answer would no longer be in doubt. Those legitimate successors were undoubtedly the Romans of Britain, those who escaped the fall of the empire at the hands of the Germanic barbarians centuries ago, only to reclaim what was theirs when the time came. However, Gaul, the eternal battleground between civilization and barbarism, would have lain half-ruined. Cities like Lutetia, Lugdunum, and Burdigala would have been shadows of their former selves. Roads would have crumbled, and entire regions would have been depopulated by famine, raids, and the endless brutality of that war. Hispania, too, would have suffered, first from the Muslim invasions of earlier centuries, then from its fractured Christian kingdoms, and finally from becoming the southern front of the Roman Reconquest. But the Western Romans would have faced such scenes before. Reconstruction, for them, would have practically been a cultural instinct by that point. And so, once again, Rome got to work. One of the very first acts of the Romano-British administration would be to erase the last remnants of Frankish/Germanic influence in Gaul. So the Western emperors would have launched a colossal project, the great project of re-romanization, sort to speak. Across Gaul, Frankish noble titles would be abolished, Germanic legal customs would be replaced by Roman civil law, Latin would be reimposed as the administrative and educational language, the old Roman road network would be rebuilt with astonishing efficiency, aqueducts would be restored, town forums would be cleared and revived, new imperial garrisons would be established in every major city, and slowly but surely the name of France would begin to fade from the minds of the people, replaced once again by the more accurate name of Gaul. The same could be said for Hispania. With all the changes and butterfly effects caused in this alternate scenario, the existence of Spain and Portugal would be completely impossible. The peninsula will forever be Hispania, or Hispania and Lusitania at most. And for the first time since the twilight years of antiquity, the Western world would look and feel Roman again. And after that, something else would begin to happen as the empire rebuilt, a cultural rebirth, a renaissance. But not the renaissance of our timeline, a rediscovery of ancient texts hidden in dusty monasteries. No, this renaissance would be something far stranger. The Romans here did not rediscover their past, since they still lived in it. Their laws were Roman, their administration was Roman, their engineering schools were Roman, their identity, their pride, their ambitions, all unmistakably Roman. But contact with the New World, the infusion of exotic crops, the influx of silver, dyes, metals, and the technological innovations born from the Roman-Frankish War would have created an atmosphere of unprecedented creativity. By the mid-1200s, scholars in Lugdunum, Burdigala, Londinium, and more would be producing works that blended Roman rationalism, Celtic sensibility, Norse navigation science, and New World botanical knowledge. This hybrid culture would be unlike anything in our timeline, and it would only be the beginning. But while Gaul and Hispania would be returning to the Roman fold, the Italian peninsula would be a different matter. Italy, the old heartland of the empire, would have become the arena of papal corruption, petty city-state rivalries, and endless disputes between aspiring northern princes and southern adventurers. The Romano-British victory in the 100 Years' War would have changed all of that. The Western Empire imposed a radical solution. Italy would be divided into 3 unified macro-regions, each with clearly defined authority and purpose. Northern Italy, Central Italy, the Papal Remnant, and Southern Italy. Freedom of worship would be formally declared in both Northern and Southern Italy, but only for variants of Christianity other than Papal Catholicism, not paganism at all, of course. They were still Christians, sadly, by that point. The Romano-British Celtic version of Christianity and Eastern Orthodoxy both would have spread rapidly among the population in all of Italy, and thanks to that, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Catholicism would have begun to die. Not through persecution, not through violence, but through irrelevance. And for the first time since late antiquity, Italy would no longer be a battleground, but a Roman buffer, stable, neutral, and culturally Romanizing once again in the real sense of the term. The empire now would have possessed a population larger and better fed than any in Europe, American crops increasing yields, wealth from terra nova pouring into the treasury, early gunpowder weapons decades ahead of schedule, combined with modernized Greek fire weapons, a massive and advanced navy, and a centralized bureaucracy that made feudal kingdoms look primitive in comparison. It is no exaggeration to say that by the mid-1200s, the now restored Western Roman Empire would be the most advanced and powerful state on the planet, easy. But just when the Western Romans would have believed they had secured the future of their civilization, news would arrive. From merchants in Trebizond, from Norse traders fleeing the east, from frightened diplomats arriving in Constantinople, they would learn that a new force had risen in Asia, a force unlike anything Europe had faced since the days of Attila the Hun, an empire of fire and arrows, a machine of conquest without pity or pause, the Mongols. As the news of the Mongols would begin to spread across Europe, panic would follow immediately behind it. Because these were not ordinary invaders, not your typical raiding party, not even the fragmented successor states of the Seljuks. No. This time, the invaders would be something far more terrifying, a people who would fight like a force of nature, a people who would burn entire cities in a single day, a people who would not negotiate, who would not rest, and who would not stop until the entire horizon belonged to them. And so, the Mongol storm, that apocalyptic tide from the Far East, would begin its march westward. At first, the Western Romans would hear only fragments, rumors carried by traders from Trebizond, reports whispered by merchants in Black Sea ports, half-mad stories told by Norse sailors arriving in Caerleon and Eboracum, speaking of entire kingdoms disappearing overnight, but little by little, the picture would become clearer and far more horrifying. Persia, that ancient land that once challenged Rome for centuries, would fall apart like paper before fire. Cities that had stood since the time of Cyrus the Great would be reduced to ashes. The Mongols simply would not care whether you surrendered or resisted. Death would arrive just the same. From there, the Mongols would move into the Arab world. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age in our timeline, the center of learning and culture, would stand no chance in this alternate world either. And once the caliphates would have collapsed, nothing would remain in the east strong enough to stop the Mongol tide. Meanwhile, in the north, the story would be even more brutal. The Proto-Russian kingdoms and federations, already weakened by internal rivalries, would be crushed ruthlessly. Cities like Kiev, Smolensk, and Vladimir would fall one after another, disappearing from maps and memories. And by the time survivors would flee into forests or tundra, the Mongols would already be preparing to move further west. But it wouldn't stop there. The Mongols would also reach the lands of the Norsemen, and this time, the Norse weren't the rugged raiders of the 9th and 10th centuries. No. These Norse societies, in this alternate timeline, would have become more stable, more urban, and more advanced, thanks to their constant contact and alliances with the Romano-British Empire. But even with all those improvements, they would be no match for the Mongols in open battle. Villages would burn, clans would scatter, entire regions of Sweden, Norway, and Finland would become wastelands. And that would be when the Western Romans would realize that their strongest northern allies would be collapsing. But perhaps nowhere would the Mongol impact be felt more dramatically than in Anatolia. After all the decades the Eastern Romans would have spent painfully reconquering the peninsula from the Turks, after rebuilding fortresses, reorganizing themes, restoring old cities, the Mongols would appear like a nightmare coming back for a second round. Armenia would be ravaged, Cappadocia would be attacked from multiple sides, and Eastern Roman generals, even with all their experience, would quickly understand that these enemies were different from anything they would have faced before. And in this alternate timeline, without papal intervention, without the Crusades and prior contacts with the Western kingdoms, the only people who would be able to help the Eastern Romans would actually be the now newly restored Western Romans. And so, messages would be sent across the Mediterranean, letters filled with urgency, desperation, and warnings of what was to come, scrolls carried by diplomats, messengers, and merchants, speaking of riders who would move like ghosts and armies that would appear out of nowhere. And in Londinium, the Western Roman Emperor would sit with those reports in hand, understanding perfectly what they meant. If the East fell, the Mongols would not stop there. The next step would be Central Europe, the Balkans, the Germanic Empire, and eventually Gaul, Italy, and Hispania itself maybe. So for the first time since late antiquity, Both empires would set aside their differences and remember who they really were, two halves of a civilization that refused to die, two branches of a legacy stretching back to Augustus, Trajan, and Constantine, two Romes, and united, they would begin to plan. The Western Romans would have many strengths, advanced gunpowder weapons decades ahead of schedule, modernized Greek fire devices, a massive and hyper-efficient navy, colonial wealth pouring from the Americas, a massive, centralized population, and armies trained with discipline, logistics, and engineering unmatched in Europe. And the Eastern Romans would bring mastery of fortified warfare, centuries of experience fighting steppe armies, elite cataphract cavalry, battle-hardened generals, deep knowledge of Anatolian terrain, and control of the Eastern Mediterranean supply lines. The two Romes would divide responsibilities strategically. The East would anchor the defense in Anatolia and the Caucasus. The West would send gunpowder engineers, auxiliary legions, and naval forces to the Black Sea and Aegean. Both would coordinate supply lines through Cyprus, Rhodes, Sicily, and Crete. And the Germanic Empire, caught in the middle, would be, quote-unquote, convinced to join the defensive coalition whether they liked it or not. Meanwhile, Western Roman fleets would transport troops at a speed unimaginable in our timeline, allowing reinforcements to reach the Eastern Front before Mongols could adapt. And so, for the first time in centuries, soldiers from Britain, Gaul, Hispania, Anatolia, and Greece would march under banners that, though different in color and design, would all carry the same idea, the same dream, the dream that was once called Rome. And with that alliance formed, with the armies mobilized, with Northern Europe begging for help, with the eastern frontier burning, the Roman world would prepare to face the greatest challenge since the days of Attila. The Mongols, who had crushed Persia, Arabia, Russia, and the Norse, would now be marching toward lands defended by the heirs of the greatest civilization of antiquity, and those Mongol barbarians would have no idea what they were about to face. With the alliance between the two Romes finally forged, with armies mobilized across two continents, and with the Mongol threat advancing like a storm that refused to die, the inevitable clash between the greatest empire of antiquity recently revived and the greatest war machine of the medieval world would at last begin. And this time, unlike so many moments in history, Europe would not stand divided, it would stand as Roman. The Mongols, as always, would strike first. Their scouts would test the Eastern Roman defenses in Anatolia, probing weak points, feigning retreats, trying to lure imperial armies into the open plains where Mongol cavalry would normally dominate. But this time, the Eastern Romans would not fall for it. They would have spent centuries fighting Turks, Arabs, Persians, and every variety of horse archer the East could produce. If there was one enemy they understood better than anyone else in the world, it was the steppe warrior type of barbarian. So instead of charging blindly, the Eastern Romans would adapt, fortresses in the interior would be reinforced, mountain passes would be fortified, supply lines would be protected with naval patrols, and mobile defensive armies would be stationed in depth across the plateau. And soon, the Mongols would realize something they had not expected. The Romans were not playing their game, they were refusing open battle, and that alone would already be a bad sign for them. Meanwhile, in the West, the Romano-British Empire would begin its own preparations. Gunpowder engineers would be dispatched across the Mediterranean, carrying with them recipes for early cannons, siege bombards, and the terrifying Greek fire siphons that had been perfected over centuries of refinement. Auxiliary legions, veterans of the Franco-Roman Hundred Years' War, would be loaded onto ships in Londinium, Burdigala, and Carthago Nova, and sail towards Cyprus, Rhodes, and Constantinople, turning the Eastern Mediterranean into an enormous Roman staging ground. And while all of this would take time, the Mongols would not wait politely. Their armies would continue ravaging the northern realms, pushing deeper into the lands of the Norse, and threatening Poland, and even the Germanic Empire. Villages would disappear, crops would burn, entire populations would flee southward, desperate for protection, and ironically, for the first time in history, Germans, Norsemen, and Romans would all understand the same truth. If Rome fell, this time, it would also mean that Europe, in the Germanic, Christian, medieval meaning of it, would also fall. The first major confrontation between the united Roman front and the Mongols would take place in eastern Anatolia, somewhere near the ancient Armenian highlands, a region shaped by centuries of warfare between civilizations. The Mongols, expecting a quick victory, would charge the fortified Roman positions with their usual terrifying coordination. Arrows would darken the sky, drums would echo across the mountains, but when they approached the Eastern Roman lines, something would be different. The Romans would answer not with arrows, but with fire, Greek fire. Launched from siphons, pots, and early pressurized devices, this weapon would ignite entire units in seconds, spreading panic in a way the Mongols had never experienced, because you cannot outrun fire, you cannot shoot it down, you cannot terrify it into stopping. And behind the walls, Roman bombards, primitive but effective, would begin firing, shattering the Mongol momentum, disrupting their formations, and forcing them into terrain where their mobility would be useless. For the first time in their westward expansion, the Mongols would be stopped, not defeated yet, but stopped, and that alone would shake their confidence. While the East held the line, the Western Romans would launch operations of their own, but in a direction the Mongols would not expect, north. Because while the Mongols would be pushing towards Central Europe, the Romano-British would not wait passively. Their fleets would land troops in the shattered Norse realms, helping survivors regroup, fortify towns, and establish defensive lines in rugged terrain where Mongol cavalry was less effective. Specialized Western Roman artillery units would be placed on elevated positions, turning hills and fjords into death traps for any Mongol force reckless enough to approach. At the same time, diplomatic envoys would reach the proto-Russian remnants, offering weapons, instructors, and political recognition in exchange for alliance, and given the circumstances, those devastated Slavic kingdoms would accept without hesitation. And slowly, a new coalition would take shape in the north, one that could fight the Mongols not on the plains, but in forests, mountains, and fortified river crossings, environments where Roman engineering and early gunpowder weapons would shine. The true turning point of the war would come when the Mongols attempted a coordinated invasion through both the Balkans and Anatolia, hoping to overwhelm Roman defenses by brute force, but it would not work. In the Balkans, Western Roman heavy infantry, armed with steel breastplates and early handheld gunpowder weapons, would hold mountain passes while Eastern Roman cataphracts launched devastating countercharges down narrow valleys. On the shores of the Black Sea, Western Roman galleys armed with Greek fire would annihilate Mongol supply ships, cutting off the logistical backbone that the horse armies desperately needed. And in Anatolia, where Mongol commanders expected an easy breakthrough, they would find instead a wall of fortresses linked by Roman roads, supplied by Roman fleets, and defended by Roman soldiers who refused to break. And slowly, the Mongols would begin to bleed, their horses would die in unfamiliar climates, their scouts would be ambushed by Roman light infantry, their commanders would be shocked by the discipline of legions that simply refused to panic, and eventually, faced with the combined might of the Eastern and Western Roman empires, the Mongols would do something they rarely had to do in their westward conquests: they would need to retreat. But once they would begin retreating, the Romans would not stop. The two Romes, united in triumph, would move from defense to offense. The Eastern Romans would reclaim all of Anatolia, pushing their borders back to the Black Sea and beyond. They would annex Armenian territories, fortify Georgia, and re-establish dominance over the Caucasus. The Western Romans, meanwhile, would move into Central Europe and the Baltic, helping reconstitute the shattered Norse and Slavic realms under Romanized, cooperative governments, and in some regions, especially along the Baltic coast and in northern Poland, the Western Empire would establish new provinces or permanent military colonies where the Teutonic Order or Germanic Crusader states settled in that region in our timeline, since the Crusades didn't happen this time around, of course. The Germanic Empire, having contributed little and survived only because Rome intervened, would see its prestige shattered and its autonomy constrained. And so, as the Mongol threat finally receded, Europe would awaken into a new political landscape, a dominant Western Roman Empire stretching from Britain to Hispania, from Gaul to partially the Baltic. A revitalized Eastern Roman Empire controlling Anatolia, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus. A Romanized arc of allied states stretching through Scandinavia, Poland, and the early Russian territories. A humiliated and increasingly irrelevant Germanic Empire. And a papal realm reduced to a cultural relic in central Italy. And for the first time since antiquity, Rome, divided into two, but united in purpose, would stand not merely as a memory, but as the defining force of European civilization once again. And the Mongols, the greatest conquerors of the medieval age, would have discovered the one enemy capable of stopping them, not by miracle, not by chance, but by the sheer weight of a civilization that refused to die. With the Mongol threat finally pushed back, with the northern realms secured, and with the eastern frontier stabilized once again, Europe would enter a new era, an era that no chronicler of our timeline would ever recognize, because in this alternate world, the continent would not emerge from the medieval period as a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and feudal enclaves. It would emerge under the shadow of a reborn, revitalized, and unstoppable Roman world and culture. And for the first time since the age of Justinian, the Mediterranean would tremble at the sound of Roman ambition once again. But before Rome could set its gaze south, it would first consolidate its victories at home. The defeat of the Mongols would change everything. The political landscape of Europe would simply not resemble anything we know from our own timeline. The Western Roman Empire, stretching from Britain to Hispania and from Gaul to portions of the Baltic coast, would stand as the single greatest power in Western Europe, while the Eastern Roman Empire, newly reconsolidated in Anatolia and the Caucasus, would rise again as the dominant force of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Norse realms, rebuilt with Roman assistance, would align themselves permanently with Western Roman interests. The Proto-Russian territories, reborn from the ashes of Mongol devastation, would gravitate toward Constantinople, adopting orthodoxy more fully and viewing the Eastern Emperor as their natural cultural protector. And in the center of the continent, the Germanic Empire, the so-called Holy Roman Empire in our timeline, would find itself humiliated, surrounded, and largely irrelevant. Its authority would be tolerated, but its influence would be minimal, a buffer state at best, a speed bump at worst. Catholicism, meanwhile, would be reduced to something it had not been in centuries, a regional curiosity, a spiritual relic, confined largely to central Italy, supported by tradition rather than power, because in this world, Christianity would have diverged dramatically. To the north and west, the Romano-British Celtic interpretation of the faith would continue to spread, emphasizing order, unity, administration, and a rational, almost robotic approach to spirituality. To the east, orthodoxy would flourish under Roman protection, shaping Slavic culture for centuries to come. And slowly, Catholicism would fade, not because it was banned, not because it was persecuted, but because it simply had nothing left to offer. And so, with Europe stabilized, with allies secured, and with rivals minimized, the Roman world would look south. For centuries, North Africa had been ruled by Islamic dynasties, kingdoms, and caliphates that had once posed existential threats to both Romes, but the Mongol invasions in the east, combined with trade disruptions, internal rivalries, and the general decay of medieval Islamic states in this alternate timeline, would leave North Africa weakened, fragmented, even more than in our timeline, and unprepared for what was coming. The Western Roman Empire, with its massive navy and its unparalleled logistical network, would begin launching campaigns along the African coast. Carthage, that ancient rival of Rome, would be taken first, symbolically, brutally, and efficiently. Then would follow Hippo, Caesarea, Tingis, and the entire Mauritanian coastline. Roman engineers would rebuild ports and fortresses as they advanced, turning North Africa into a logistical extension of Hispania. Roads would be restored, cities repopulated, irrigation repaired, and grain, the eternal lifeblood of Rome, would once again flow north like in the good old days. Meanwhile, the Eastern Romans would begin their own campaigns southward. Egypt, weakened by centuries of instability, would fall quickly. Alexandria would be restored as a jewel of Hellenistic Roman heritage. Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean Islands would be secured as naval stepping stones. And slowly, step by step, the Levantine coast would return to Roman hands, not through crusades, but through cold, efficient imperial expansion, again, like in the good old days. By the early 1300s, the Mediterranean would no longer be a contested sea. It would once again be, unmistakably, a Roman lake. With Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean returning to imperial rule, Italy would increasingly find itself surrounded by Roman power on all sides. Northern Italy, wealthy, urban, and deeply connected to Roman trade networks, would choose integration willingly into the Western Roman administrative structure. Southern Italy, bound by centuries of Eastern Roman influence, would naturally align with Constantinople, adopting a formal protectorate status under the Eastern Empire. And what would remain of the Papal States, shrinking, isolated, powerless, would become little more than a ceremonial curiosity, a spiritual museum left untouched out of polite respect for tradition, not authority, since Rome, the city itself, would still stand, of course, but for the first time since the fall of the Western Empire, it would no longer command nations, it would merely host a bishop. Meanwhile, the true capitals of Rome would be Londinium in the west and Constantinople in the east, the twin centers of a dual Roman world. And as the Mediterranean stabilized and imperial borders expanded, something extraordinary would begin to happen across both Romes, a renaissance, but not the renaissance of our timeline, where scholars rediscovered ancient manuscripts and tried to piece together the wisdom of a lost civilization. This renaissance would be born from a civilization that never lost itself, from a Rome that survived, adapted, evolved, and now prospered. Trade with the Americas would bring crops, wealth, and raw materials beyond anything the ancients could have imagined. Roman ports in Hispania and Gaul would swell with silver, dyes, maize, potatoes, medicinal plants, and exotic fruits. And this enormous boost in nutrition, agriculture, and commerce would fuel population growth, innovation, and a technological acceleration centuries ahead of schedule. Universities in Lugdunum, Carthage, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Iberacum would become centers of mathematics, engineering, astronomy, naval science, and medicine. Gunpowder research would explode, Greek fire would be perfected into safer, more refined formulas, and shipbuilding would advance into territories resembling early modern designs. And so, by the mid-1300s, Europe would not be crawling out of the Middle Ages. It would be standing on the edge of an industrial and scientific revolution guided entirely by Roman hands. But even in this age of triumph, even as the two Romes would dominate the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and half of Eurasia, one question would still linger. What could they do with the Germanic Empire? The Germanic Empire, battered, humiliated, and surrounded, would not accept Roman supremacy lightly. And while they would not dare challenge Rome openly, tensions would grow beneath the surface. Diplomats would argue, borders would shift, trade disputes would emerge, and cultural rivalry, already thousands of years old, would intensify. Because deep down, both sides would know the truth. The future of Europe would be decided not in Africa, not in the East, not in Terra Nova, but in the heart of the continent itself. Would Europe become eternally Roman? Or would the Germanic peoples attempt one last defiance against the true representatives of the true Western culture? Only time will tell. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I want to thank you all for being so patient while waiting for this part 4 of this alternate scenario, and I hope that despite everything, it has lived up to your expectations. I am very sorry that I couldn't talk about many more details about the setting in this part, as well as obviously all the others about the Americas and the indigenous people, as well as the obvious deaths that would have been caused by the diseases brought by the Europeans and Vikings. There are simply too many topics to cover. And if I were to do a part 5, that part 5 would be dedicated to talking specifically about those problems, not to mention the consequences that would exist between the relations with the Roman colonies in the Americas and the Western Empire itself, especially after the arrival of the Black Death, because yes, I think that even with the Mongols having been expelled from Europe in this timeline, the Black Death would eventually reach the West, even if it is several decades later than predicted. Anyway, I hope you'll forgive me for that lack of lore to discuss, because as I just said, there's too much to cover in this incredible world we've created in this 4-part series about Western Rome surviving in Britain. Also, I'm letting you know that I won't be setting a like goal for part 5 of this story, for reasons I'll explain in the near future, probably after the sequel to the story about if King Romulus was really the son of Mars. Thank you for your understanding, and thank you very, very much for your support, all of you. You are a great community that I am very happy to have built over these months, and I have really enjoyed making videos on this channel and every week seeing you react to my work. And without anything else to say, see you next time.